Hello everyone and welcome. I hope everyone can hear me well now. I hope no one is facing any problems. If you do face any problems, please write on the chat box to notify us. So this is an EU supported initiative by Sabancı University International Policies Institutions and Olaf Palme Foundation. This is the fifth session of a series of conversations where we talk about the human rights and violations in this period. We have three speakers. We have some questions prepared for them already. And before that, I will be introducing them to you. First speaker is Şebnem Korur Fincancı, the president of the Turkish Human Rights Foundation. He graduated from Cerrahpaşa Faculty of Medicine, and between 1987 and 1990, she also received her undergraduate education at Istanbul University on classical archaeology, and she is also a founding member of the Forensic Medicine Experts Association of Turkey, as well as the Turkish Penal Law Association, and she dedicated her life to combating torture. And she's a milestone in that regard. And since 2009, she is the president of the Human Rights Foundation of Turkey. Our second speaker is Turgut Tarhanlı from Bilgi University, who teaches international law and human rights law at Bilgi University, who is the director of the Human Rights Application and Research Center. He studied at the Harvard University, United States, Princeton University in terms of universal jurisdiction and human rights. He took part in research projects in these fields in 2002 for his contribution on the protection of the refugee rights in Turkey. He received a certificate of appreciation from the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, and he was also elected a member of the Advisory Board on Human Rights of the Prime Minister's Office, Turkey, and in 2006 he was selected as the representing member from Europe to the Swedish NGO Foundation for Human Rights, and he is a member of the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, the Turkish Human Rights Foundation, International Amnesty Turkey, and founding member for these associations, and he's also a member of the Transparency International Global Relations Forum and the Bar Association of Istanbul. Another speaker we have is Zafar Crutch, who has been a human rights advocate for long years. He took part in the foundation of the Human Rights Initiative for Mental Health Association, the Criminal Enforcement System Civil Society Association, the Civil Society Development Center, and Anadolu Kültür. And he is mainly focusing on the protection of the rights and freedoms of the inmates, and also equal and full participation of everyone, including people who have psychosocial problems and who are disabled. And he is continuing his rights-based advocacy activities, and he is taking part in different projects, including the European Commission Turkish delegation supported project called Going Beyond Prison Walls, and the project to establish a local monitoring and reporting group on mental health. So I wasn't able to summarize all these things because he's very busy. So in this first session, we are going to pose the participants the questions that we have prepared. And in the second part, we will be receiving your questions to further enrich this session. Throughout this meeting, please make sure that your microphones are muted. Otherwise, there is a lot of sound confusion. And if you do have any questions, feel free to use the chat box at the bottom of the screen. If you want to ask any questions, you can use the chat box or use the raise hand option if you want to ask your question verbally. So if you can raise your hand from that section, you can be a part of the conversation. And this webinar is also being recorded, and it will be streamed on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube accounts. So as we are recording this session, we would like to remind you that if your video is on and if you are unmuted, your voice as well as your image will be recorded. So welcome once again. And I will start with my first question. Well, my first question directly goes to Ms. Şebnem. We wanted to open the session with her. The Turkish Human Rights Foundation completed its 30th anniversary last month. Since the day you started your activities, of course, in Turkey, in the field of human rights, there have been a lot of activities. So how do you assess this process? What has happened since the day you started your activities? All around the world, of course, important achievements have been made thanks to this human rights struggle. So we would like to hear your part of the story. We don't want to talk about the downsides only. We want to start with upsides, the achievements. So what are the most important achievements in that regard? The floor is yours. Yes, first of all, thank you very much. I would like to thank the Hrant Dink Foundation for organizing this meeting, for bringing us together. Of course, we don't have the chance to see everyone as as we have a limited screen, and we do not have any physical contact as it is the case in meeting rooms, but still, this gathering is very valuable for us. Well, first of all, yes, we are celebrating our 30th anniversary. This is an important amount of time when you think about it. Our 30th anniversary will be completed on the 30th of December 2020. However, we already started our 30th anniversary activities on the 26th of June, the day for solidarity for torture, victims of torture and their relatives. So our first activities started on this day with our statements and publications, because we do believe that the 26th of June is important. Yes, we have seen in the 1990s grave human rights violations, important violations. And since those days, of course, the Human Rights Foundation of Turkey has never worked alone. We have been working with the Association of Human Rights and other associations. We have seen many positive changes, and we were the leaders of such change. I guess one of the biggest contributions we had, not only for Turkey, but for the world, is that effective prosecution of torture and documentation of torture, namely the Istanbul Protocol, was published by the United Nations. That's a big achievement. And all international organizations and human rights courts are now referring to this document. So we have been able to prepare, together with the other human rights associations, this important document that is referenced by different courts. And the Physicians for Human Rights Association in the US is also important, because as our foundation, since the beginning of 1990s, we have been actively working with the Physicians for Human Rights. Well, among the writers of that work, of course, we have Mr. Turgut Tarhanlı, dear Turgut Tarhanlı. So that was an important publication or effort, especially for victims and survivors of torture. That's a guideline for the lawyers and healthcare professionals, as well as human rights advocates. So it's also important for the states to prepare their independent monitoring mechanisms in terms of its suggestions and recommendations to the states. And all around the world, this is still widely being used. Maybe we can talk about another important thing. If we didn't have this protocol, this Istanbul Protocol, or this manual on the effective investigation and documentation of torture, we wouldn't be able to know how the main documents would be put into use. So I would like to commemorate a dear friend, Maria Kalli, whom we lost last year from Greece. She has been the director of the Center Against Torture, and she's a physician, and she made great contribution in terms of the preparation of the definition of torture and preparation of the document to convention. She has been a guiding person for us. There are so many people guiding us throughout this journey, and thanks to them, we are trying to pave this way and bring light along the way to other people. Of course, almost all around the world, we see that such efforts and such initiatives are being carried out by different people, and this manual, this guideline is very important for all these efforts. And in terms of the methods of torture used in Turkey and their medical assessments, and in terms of diagnosis, our organization, our foundation is carrying out scientific research. So we're not only documenting torture processes or human rights violations, but we are using scientific methods to come up with data on the torture mechanism. Of course, value needs to be mentioned here, especially in terms of different torture methods. Bone scintigraphy method was used for him, especially for birch rods, using birch rods, again for the diagnosis of electrical torture. We have our colleagues from Ege University. Well, the initial work always comes from Ege University, and our colleagues from the pathology department and other departments, they came up with some diagnosis methods for different torture methods. We have from our colleague from Denmark, who is among the writers of the protocol for the diagnosis of electrical torture. They were helping us. They helped us a lot. And again, my friend for half a century, neurologist Hakan Gönkor, also helped us for the diagnosis of different types of torture, like hanging. So from a scientific perspective, we have been able to make great contribution. Again, most recently, we had another study, especially the thermal cameras used by plumbers or as night vision. We are now using it to detect injuries, skin injuries. And thanks to these cameras, we can now identify the injuries even after 6 months. And we just concluded this study. It's valid, it's reliable, and it's a very specific one. So in terms of the achievements, yes, we have achieved to publish scientific research and this guideline, the manual. And in terms of diagnosing the conventional methods of torture, we now have progress so that the state is giving up on them. So we can talk about the other methods later on. I have taken much of your time. Maybe for the time being, I'll stop here. Thank you. Of course, we will talk about the most recent period and what's happening now. The second question is about this COVID period. Today, we're not only discussing the health dimension of COVID, but when it comes to education, public gathering areas, discrimination, etc., the World Health Organization is preparing many different documents and policies. Our question is for Mr. Turgut. Can you talk about how Turkey is reacting these policies? Are we able to follow up on these policies? Are we lagging behind? What is the situation? The floor is yours. Thank you. And maybe Mr. Zafer can also answer this question. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you. Yes, of course, before I answer your question on the World Health Organization's policies, I would like to start by thanking you for inviting me to this session, allowing me to share my ideas on this topic. Of course, this is a multidimensional topic. We have the medical dimension, of course, which is important, but human rights dimension and rights advocacy is also very important. So in terms of the policies of the World Health Organization, when you ask this question to me, I immediately think about other initiatives of the United Nations, because WHO is a specialized agency of the United Nations. So regarding human rights and protection of health and the relation of that to human rights, UN is working hand in hand with WHO, the High Commissioner of Human Rights and the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the UN Council. They work together with the WHO and they come up with recommendations together. And we need to emphasize the fact that when it comes to the right to health, the approach of WHO and compared with the other UN agencies brings a more social, wider social perspective. So it's not a restricted document or reference that is restricted with legal aspects. So it's a very wide concept, taking into consideration many other factors such as health, etc. It's only natural that the World Health Organization is working that way. But in terms of implementing the policies, we have some references at the legal sphere, and the International Convention on Economic and Social Rights, that convention, and especially Article 12 of that convention is very important. The right to have access to the highest standard of health as it is defined. Of course, World Health Organization works in connection with the medical world. They have recommendations on this, but we are mainly focusing on the rights-based aspect of this. So an important element for the World Health Organization is the Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. Turkey has been a party to this convention for 17 years. And if we are to look at how WHO approaches the issue from the perspective of this convention, especially from the perspective of right to health, we can maybe discuss this later on from the perspective of Turkey. Well, the right to health during a pandemic should not be limited to the right of health only. We need to have a wider perspective. Of course, we need to pay attention to the right to health, but we need to consider this together with other rights and freedoms. So WHO plus human rights agencies of the United Nations have to develop these policies hand in hand because of this. That's another reason why they are doing so. And both the human rights agencies of the United Nations and the WHO focus on these fundamental elements specifically for the realization of different rights on health. They are making references to different issues. For instance, the existence of such a right and respect to such a right. Respect to this right by the side of the government and non-state actors. And then the right to health being accessible is important. And thirdly, this has to be something acceptable by the society. And these are the policy elements. And last but not least, the quality of the service provided. Unfortunately, not every country in the world has the opportunity to benefit from these services. But an important element from the perspective of interdisciplinary approach is that these 4 items, availability, accessibility, quality, and admissibility. Accessibility is important. In terms of accessibility, first of all, a non-discrimination principle has to be imposed effectively for people to benefit from this service. Regardless of the reason, there should be a non-discriminatory approach. Everyone should be able to benefit from these services without any discrimination. This is on the policy side, and it has its implications on the implementation. And then physical access being provided. This is the second dimension of accessibility, because accessibility has 4 sub topics. Then economic accessibility, meaning affordability, the social security system available in the country, supporting this. Who is supporting this? Who can benefit? Can they really benefit from this? Or in terms of the methodologies for treatment or the medicines, drugs, can they afford it? And fourth, access to information. This is important. And specifically for Turkey, we need to discuss this topic because access to information when it comes to WHO, United Nations, UNHCR, or United Nations Human Rights Commission, they define it as asking for or demanding information on health issues. This is a rights-related area. Asking for information, demanding information, and then the information being provided to the person. And thirdly, an infrastructure that will make sure that this transfer of information is made available. So all these topics around information are part of the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And another convention is important here, again, dating from 1966, and Turkey ratified it in 2003, the International Convention on Civil Rights, Article 19, access to information. And certain research, finding, scientific finding being shared with the public or asking for such information. So for WHO's rights-based approach regarding health issues, and in terms of the approach of other UN agencies, we have to check first that they have a policy profile to cover all these principles that I have mentioned, and the practices in the country need to be assessed from that perspective. So I can touch upon a couple of more issues, but I don't want to exceed my time. So if you allow me, I can maybe say a few more words. So an important issue here is the issue of participation. Well, you don't necessarily have to have a pandemic to talk about participation. A country already has to take participation into consideration when preparing a health strategy and plan. Non-state actors, individuals, the society at large, academia, professional organizations, they need to support and participate in such processes. It's very important. That's the general principle in terms of the making of the health policies, but this is even more important during pandemics. Accountability, transparency, and protection of health and relevant public policies to be implemented for the protection of health and monitoring for this, getting information on that. And if there is any irregularity, then the ability to ask for an intervention about this and follow up on that. So participation and inclusion is very, very important from that perspective. So, of course, one can say that this is an extraordinary period, and during such extraordinary periods, we can also implement emergency measures. So if it's necessary during such natural catastrophes, disasters, just like in a war or a social uprising, you can actually declare a state of emergency. Turkey did not do that, but there are countries that have declared a state of emergency, and the governments declaring emergencies is in a way worrying us. For instance, Council of Europe member states, let's take a look at that. In terms of the European Convention of Human Rights, if they say I am declaring state of emergency, so I will impose certain derogations to narrow down my liabilities, I will not be abiding by the provisions of the convention fully during this. So among 47 member states, only 10 states have declared state of emergency, and 6 of them have already withdrawn the emergency. 4 still continue: San Marino, Serbia, Armenia, and Georgia. These are the 4 countries, but Armenia already said that they will be ending the state of emergency soon on the 13th of July. A similar situation can be seen at the UN level in terms of the Convention on civil and political rights. In terms of the protection of people's rights in that aspect, they have declared state of emergency. We have 13 UN member states: Guatemala, Latvia, Estonia, Armenia, Ecuador, Romania, Peru, Palestine, the state of Palestine, Chile, Kyrgyzstan, Colombia, El Salvador, and Georgia. These are the 13 UN member states that have declared state of emergency. So in an open and transparent way, they are saying that from the perspective of such and such rights, in terms of human rights, I'm not going to be able to abide by the rights emerging from the convention. Let's see which rights these are: freedom of movement, non-intervention in private life, freedom of assembly and association, freedom of organization, and in a restricted way. For instance, Guatemala also said that they could restrict freedom of expression. The other countries aren't doing that. Even the special rapporteur of UN, David Kane, the special rapporteur on freedom of expression, he said that we cannot accept that freedom of expression is made a subject of derogation during this extraordinary time, because Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, paragraph 2, talks about protection, the restriction of rights for the protection of public health. And there are already legitimate bases for restricting this right. So including this in the regime of a state of emergency is unthinkable, he says. So we need to be against this. And because they use the expression freedom of expression, you need to still have your freedoms, and your freedoms have to be followed upon. But the great thing and uncertain thing is that both in terms of the Council of Europe's European Convention on Human Rights and in terms of the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, states declaring such derogations have openly acted and openly already declared states of emergency. However, despite the fact that they impose extraordinary measures in their countries, there are so many states and countries that are imposing actually extraordinary measures, but they haven't shared with the UN or the Council of Europe these. So human rights bodies are complaining And Michelle Bachelet, who is the High Commissioner for Human Rights, emphasized this in her speech at the end of April. She said such and such states have declared states of emergency. Yes, we see that. We see that they are restricting people's rights. We are aware of this. We know this, but unfortunately, there is a huge group of states that are restricting the rights without declaring it, without openly, publicly saying this. So it's very important from the perspective of Turkey, even though there is no official state of emergency declared and even the international bodies have not been notified of, we have some rights restrictions or limitations that can correspond to such a state of emergency. So maybe I can just stop here. So I can stop here and I can talk later in terms of the protection of health standards by the WHO and UN. So from the human rights perspective, this is an important framework for the agency. I think this would be enough for beginning, for introduction.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This has been very enlightening. I wish to receive input of Zafar Crutch to this question, but I think he left the room. Okay, he's back. He's back. Welcome back. I would like to also receive your input about the previous question. Well, having 3 cats at home keeps you busy. Well, in fact, Professor Tarhanlı has already put everything into context in a very accurate manner, but I would like to first thank the Hrant Dink Foundation and to you and your colleagues for organizing such an event, for talking about human rights, and for all your efforts, the entire team, including the interpreters. Professor Korur, Şebnem Korur, is also with us. She has an experience of 30 years, expertise in the fields of human rights. My personal library includes her books, very important guidelines. And we are always very much looking forward to and learning from her organization, the Foundation of Human Rights Foundation of Turkey, and I would like to congratulate her and the organization for the 13th anniversary. And I wish, we do not have human rights as an agenda item, so that there would be no human rights violations in Turkey. We will get rid of human rights violations and we will only be able to talk about the nature, animals, and their rights. Can you hear me well? Yes, every now and then there is a feedback and some noise, but we can hear you. Professor Turgut Tarhanlı has already given us a very concise account. But I would like to note that it is not only WHO that draws some legal documents, but there is another organization called International Penal Organization. We work with them, we use their documents. So other international organizations have also published quite important documents, and these documents came out in the initial week of the pandemic, and they were also immediately translated into Turkey. UNICEF contributed for their translation. And especially those about detention during pandemic. And Professor Tarhanlı has just mentioned the information of right information. And of course, we had been in touch with the Ministry of Justice to understand the whereabouts of children who are under detention. However, even though I wanted to exercise my right to information, I could not get any response. Unfortunately, this is not a surprise. But then I prepared a video, and I knew that, and I know that it spread around. It was received well, and it could raise awareness about the children's rights, the rights of children under detention in prisons. And yes, WHO, International Penal Organization, Committee Against Torture, all these organizations asked for the suspension of detaining children or having new children inmates in prisons. And this is quite important. They also asked authorities to release children who are already detained so that they are placed with their families. And another very important element was the protection of health and well-being of juveniles. So this is what I wanted to emphasize myself. What I said is the children in prison, we need to get information about their circumstances. Do they get access to their parents, their families? Do they get information? And then this is, at the end of the day, a pandemic. It's a health issue. And we are listening to various health experts every day on TV. And even in that case, we get quite confused. That's why we need to collaborate with people. But when I say people, we need to collaborate with experts who will be delivering health-related messages directly to children, tailoring them to children about wearing masks, to understand if there are necessary hygiene rules in place, if masks can be distributed to children free of charge. So my proposal was to set up a team of 3 experts, 1 social worker, one children expert, and 1 health expert. So I insisted the Ministry of Justice of setting up such a mechanism. And do you know what kind of response I got from the Ministry of Justice? The prison managements provide necessary information to children about pandemic. So that gave me a great relief, as you would imagine. Well, I've been working about the prisons for the last 20 years and thinking of prison staff. I do not believe that they have enough capacity, first of all, to get all this information about pandemic and then share this with children. Thank you very much. Let me proceed with my second question, which is about civil society at large. Civil society has been using a number of instruments, tools for rights struggle. The ones that we're familiar with are reporting and monitoring and reporting. So my first question to Şebnem Korur, are you able to continue your monitoring activities? What are the restrictions or obstacles you are faced with, if any? And if you are faced with obstacles, how are you able to overcome them? Thank you very much once again. I would like to also make a contribution about sharing of information or providing information that Turgut has mentioned. Just a few days ago, Bursa Provincial Health Directorate filed a lawsuit against Kayahan Pala because of the information he provided, and other colleagues also were will be receiving some lawsuits. They will be prosecuted for misinforming public, on charges of misinforming public. So even if they are doing their duties to inform the public and to warn public, they are faced with legal action. And what the Ministry of Justice says, this is not their area of expertise. We have our own experts, we have our own healthcare experts, we have our own people. So that's what they have been doing all these years. So there is no relation whatsoever at the moment between the authorities and civil society. You may well ask the question if such a civil society public sector relationship existed before. It was limited, but still we could still communicate some of our demands to the authorities, to the ministries. For instance, as far as I know, CISST, Civil Society in the Penal System Association, because they have been working intensively on prisons, there was a certain line of communication with authorities, with the ministry. At the moment, our information sources are limited, and we are also familiar now with this threat to shut down the social media, and we should expect that this may in fact happen because previous draft bills or amendments were easily passed from the parliament. If this happens, if the social media is shut down, then we will have only the mainstream media. And as you know, the mainstream media for such a long time is under control. The mainstream media outlets, newspapers, they are being published even with the same headline. And whenever there is a human rights violation, and whenever a rights organization tries to raise awareness about a rights violation, mainstream media always responds to that and reacts to that, and trying to portray these right violation information as if it is associated with some terrorism or it comes from some terror-linked people. But of course, one of the most important decisions and judgments about the court decisions, of course, are the lawyers, because lawyers are the ones that are able to receive information, they are able to receive investigation files, case files. But we know that in recent practices, there are now even some special circumstances that lawyers are being banned from accessing investigation files. They are not able to access investigation files. Yes, we have independent lawyers, these are independent lawyers, but now there is a discussion of a new bar association election system which foresees multiple bar associations in provinces. And as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights already acknowledges, if there is a mounting pressure on civil society or on individuals, individuals also have the right to struggle and have the right to react. And the government at the moment is resorting to different methods. For instance, the prosecution of human rights activists, the administrative fines, and some direct or indirect threats towards human rights activists or defenders. But no matter what the government does, the human rights activists, defenders, they continue with their struggle. And we have a documentation center. We are insisting on publishing our reports, and especially in this new period, we are making efforts to disseminate them widely on the internet. And one of the lessons learned for us during that period was about social media. We are now much better when it comes to managing social media, and we are now quicker and better in social media management. And this is really good news, because previously, when there would be an incident, let's say a rights violation, we should be in a position to immediately, in 1 or 2 minutes, come up with an announcement and to explain our action points. So this mounting pressure also serves as a learning curve for us. We also learn how to react swiftly. In fact, if you look around, the countries that are able to use the social media the best are those countries that feel this crackdown, this pressure the most. That's also the countries where citizen journalism is highly developed. Yes, during these times we are faced with certain issues, certain limitations, but we continue our struggle. And by the way, this is not only the case in Turkey, this is not only the case with the Turkish authorities. When we do our work and do monitoring and reporting, we also inform the international audience, we inform international community and authorities. And I'm not only talking about my organization, Human Rights Foundation of Turkey. I believe that during the pandemic, one of the organizations that are publicly most trusted is the Union of Turkish Physicians, because they have contributed greatly and they made a lot of efforts to provide accurate information to the public. And they have very important epidemiologists, infectious disease specialists. These are members of the Association of Physicians of Turkey, and these are the ones that are facing pressure the most. Zafar Crutch, would you like to add to Şebnem Hanım's remarks? Yes, I would like to contribute as well. Monitoring and reporting are the favorite activities of us as civil society organizations. But on the other hand, these are the least favorites. These are detested even by the authorities, by governments, because those rulers, governments, they would not like to see some problematic areas being reported and well known in public and in the international community. Or if there's a rights violation, the offender will also not be so happy about such a reporting. Perpetrator will also not be happy about the reporting. And there are very important organizations in Turkey, like the Human Rights Foundation of Turkey, Human Rights Association in Turkey, with 40 branches in 40 provinces in Turkey. As Şebnem Korur Fincancı mentioned, we have the Association of Physicians of Turkey. And please allow me to also refer to GIST, a civil society independent system association, which I founded, and we do work on this. We organize focus groups. For instance, we have one focus group working with LGBTI and senior citizens or elderly inmates. Another focus group working on children or young people. So we have also thematic reporting based on different groups. But I would like to also emphasize that we are not able to carry out an independent monitoring. And of course, this is the right of all citizens. Our citizens have the right to know what happens if there's an incident or a rights violation. But it's not so easy to have an organization that is capable of doing independent monitoring, because as Şebnem Hanım, Professor Korucu, is an expert in the field, monitoring has its own criteria. So if you are visiting a penitentiary institution, you have certain monitoring parameters. If you are visiting a mental health care facility, it has its own criteria. You may know that we used to have a Turkey human rights institution almost in the capacity of a Turkish ombudsman, and now it is renamed as the Institution of Human Rights and Equality. Previously, I had the chance to visit several prisons through this institution. It was unannounced visit. It was not announced and arranged visit, but I believe it was quite important. We also visited in Metris prison, a rehabilitation facility. So independent monitoring has its own criteria, and I wish that we are able to perform independent visits, independent studies, and we can write independent reports. And as you will remember, in Cizre, a southeastern town in Turkey, a human rights delegation, a group of human rights delegation visited the town because there was a curfew of 40 days, and they reported, they prepared a very detailed, a very meticulous reports about human rights violations during curfew. But that was an independent report. But what happened is that right after they made this report, some of the organizations that contributed to the preparation of this report, including Gündem Çocuk or Agenda Child in English, they were closed down. That came as a punishment for writing or preparing this independent report. In fact, such independent reports serves us all, including the authorities, governments.
The next question will be a more practical one about the most recent enforcement regulation. In terms of rights violations and human rights, what is your take on this? And especially, what kind of arrangements or new regulations are there creating violations specifically from this perspective? Can you answer the question? This is question number 1. And question number 2 is the following. We know that there are a lot of restrictions on communication. So there is limited communication at the time. So what is your experience? How do you access or communicate with the inmates? And what is your take on the most recent enforcement regulation? So, Mr. Zafer, maybe you can continue and then we can pass it on to the other speakers. Yes. Okay. By the way, I will start by making a minor addition to the previous question. Well, that was a very good question. Well, you're not able to act, but do you have any room for maneuver was the question as I understood. Yes, we do have a lot of initiatives, efforts. For instance, we have a dedicated team by Adil Okay and his colleagues. And they are not even in one of the 3 major cities. I think they are either located in Antalya or Mersin. So they have this group of people that really had a lot of communication with the inmates. They're called görülmüştür in Turkish, or seen. So we have to mention their names. And then the Turkish Human Rights Foundation, I don't know when they started it, but they started to provide their violation reports on a daily basis. That's very important. Yes. We were doing it on a daily basis, Zafer, but we now have weekly publications, short videos. So thank you for reminding that. Yes, the daily reports were very important because maybe Şebnem will talk about it. Last week, we had a meeting and a few important topics were mentioned. If Şebnem doesn't mention, maybe I will say it because they were important points. In this process, one of the maneuvers, for instance, well, I personally am not representing any association at the time. Yes, I worked in the foundation of many associations, and if anybody asks, I would still go and willingly work for them. But for instance, Ms. Tuluhan, the documentary or photographs she took in juvenile prisoners helped me carry out a lot of campaign work or be engaged in discussions with the civil society. I tried to go to the universities. And for instance, when the government or the state says we have made this wonderful juvenile room for children, you have a photo of it, and I discuss it for 1 hour, how that room that is considered as wonderful by the government or state can ruin a child's life. We try to discuss these topics. These are very important. For instance, so many NGOs are making videos, so these were among the efforts. So let me continue with your question on the enforcement arrangements. Yes, we didn't see the emergence of an equal and fair regulation. You asked us to talk about the upsides, not downsides, but this is happening. People always tell me, why don't you talk about the part of the glass that is full, but the glass is broken. So, I mean, that's the truth. That is the case. So we need to talk about these downsides. But I don't believe that talking about the downsides or negative aspects will cause us to lose our positivity. On the contrary, an unnecessary hope will make you idle. You start thinking, oh, someone is taking care of these issues, no problem. But then we just see that only 10 people have shown up when there is a press statement. Yes, people are not paying attention to this. Yes, there may be hope, but the truth is not everyone is interested. So you personally have to go to that press statement. You need to make more efforts. So this law on enforcement is not an equal and fair one, meaning people like Osman Kavala, a friend of mine with whom we started working on prison together in the beginning of 2000s. We didn't even have Anadolu Kültür established at that time. And unfortunately, at the moment, Osman Kavala himself is in such a penitentiary institution. We need to redress this unjust situation. We have Ahmet Altan, Selahattin Demirtaş, or other people. None of these people were able to benefit from the new enforcement law. What I'm saying as a statement in general is the following. So the law on enforcement says people who would harm the society, like terrorists, etc., will not be able to benefit from this law. That's the criteria. But those who are released and those who are still inside the prison, when you look at them, that is an awkward criteria. I mean, can you imagine? Drug dealers, you are a drug dealer, a member of an organized drug you are a member of an organization that sells drugs, and then you find yourself released. I mean, isn't that being harmful to the society? On the other hand, other people are still inside the prison. So that's proof that this is not an equal and fair treatment. And by the way, COVID was used as an excuse for the change on the law on enforcement. They say that WHO and other health organizations recommend that we should release the burden in prisons. And for a long time, they weren't able to declare an amnesty because this political party wanted to pass a law on pardoning these prisons, an amnesty law. But what happened here is that they used the COVID pandemic as an excuse to relieve the burden of this overcapacity in prisons. About 60 or 70,000 people, we don't even know the exact figures, they're keeping it like a secret. When you go to the webpage of the Ministry of Justice, General Directorate of Prisons, you can't have access to any data. You can't see the number of juveniles, you can't see the number of women, you can't see the number of people who benefited from this new enforcement regulation. You can't see this data. You have to wait for the minister himself to make a statement or a press member to ask him these questions. Only then you can get your hands on some numbers or figures. So they worked hard day and night for the new enforcement law just to empty the prisons a little bit. But let me give you some bad news. I've been calling the prisons. Let's call them together. Let's call 10 prisons for these ex-convicts to get back to the prison again is so fast. Those who are released immediately find themselves in prison again. So I do not think that this new enforcement law had any use at all. I believe in the concept of restorative justice versus this revengist approach of justice. So instead of this revenge-taking approach, there is an approach or effort now to restore things. There is the restorative justice dimension, yes. And I'm not talking about rehabilitation, by the way, but I'm talking about restoring. But that was maybe an opportunity. We came up with the following demand saying that the juveniles should be released as soon as possible. If you are really going to use COVID as an excuse and release 70,000 people, you should release juveniles as well. They didn't. Do you know how many children or juveniles benefited in total from this new regulation? Only 250. Only 250 juveniles benefited from this regulation. And that's all I want to say for the time being. Okay, Şebnem, we would like to hear your experience in this period. How were you able to communicate with the inmates? Were you able to reach out to them? Or any other additional remarks about the enforcement law? Of course. As mentioned by dear Zafer, we do not have any possibility to work on prisons. We cannot put our hands on the exact figures as mentioned by him, but I had an educated guess, a rough estimation in line with the press statements of the ministry. We had, before the enactment of the law, 300,000 people in the prisons. About 50,000 of them were serving time because of or due to the law on fight against terrorism. And I said 1 out of every 5 or 6 people in the prisons is a terrorist. So we're living in a country that is so full of terrorists. So this is the illusion that is created. And of course, these people were excluded from the law on enforcement. And dear Turgut, maybe he will talk about the details of the law, but we know from previous experience that pregnancy period and post-labor and breastfeeding period prevented women from serving time in prison. They would benefit from the opportunity of delaying their enforcement. But with the most recent law, if you are arrested under the framework of law against terrorism, you are not subject to this exemption if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, you are immediately put into prison. We are now seeing examples of women waiting to deliver their babies. The police is waiting in front of the prison gate 15 days prior to their labor due date, and they are just being brought to the hospital, they deliver, and they immediately come back. And in a de facto basis, this was done before, and now with the new law, they are not able to benefit from these new arrangements or regulations brought with the new law. And then inmates who are ill, who are seriously ill or who have serious health problems, the number was 590 based on the most recent figures provided by the ministry. So they're still inside. How do we reach out to these people? Of course, lawyers are an important channel, families, and family associations are again a source of information for us to reach out to these people, to communicate with this. And Görülmüştür is an important association. They are based in Mersin province. They are working from Mersin to, of course, inform us, help us be informed. And of course, we have the letters of the inmates. They are sending letters to many different institutions, among which we have the Association of Human Rights, the Turkish Human Rights Foundation. I mean, these are the channels that I use to have direct access to the letters. Then we have the Turkish Physicians Association and the human rights commissions in every province. And of course, we have our colleagues, thanks to whom we are able to communicate with these people in the form of a solidarity. For instance, in Shakran prison, one of the physicians of the prison was hospitalized because of a suspicion on COVID-19. Well, we were able to learn this information through someone we know, because the families need to know it as well. We talked about the right to access information, but the families did not have the opportunity. And then another physician was hospitalized because of COVID-19. And in Shakran prison, we have some cases now. And also among the prison workers, we have learned that there are so many people who were hospitalized by COVID-19. This indicates that the conditions of hygiene are not very good. And in the prison in Urfa, we learned through the lawyers that there was no water for 4 days. I mean, imagine lack of water for 4 days during a pandemic. It means that the pandemic will spread in that prison very fast. Well, the Ministry of Justice was making fancy statements about the cases in prisons, but even before those statements were made, together with Ömer Faruk Gergerlioğlu, by the way, I would like to thank him. We have some MPs working relentlessly about the topic. They are working as human rights advocates within the parliament. He announced the case in Sincan prison to us, and then in Sivas similarly, and in Samsun we had some cases. And we also learned through the relatives of the patients about this type of information. So we're trying to reach out to information from different sources, from different people. That's how it happens in the human rights advocacy system. We get information from different sources and we try to confirm them, and if confirmed, we share it with the larger society. But of course, the law on enforcement, as mentioned, was made using the pandemic as an excuse to release members of the mafia, child abusers, drug dealers, drug traffickers. They use this as an excuse to release these people in Turkey. And we don't know the exact population of the prisons currently. Let me give you some figures and wrap up. In Turkey, in the most recent years, since 2015, there has been a process of rapid change in the prison population. Every year, about 200,000 people go to prison, and again, another 200,000 people are released from prison. So it's such a rapid turnaround of people. So it's for sure that they will have no problem in terms of filling the vacancies, because the moment someone is labeled as a terrorist because of a post on social media or even a small sentence, you can be arrested in Turkey. But maybe you have seen it. If you are abusing your 3-year-old grandchild, it takes days and days for you to be arrested. And that can only be done only if the women lawyers insist on the follow-up of the situation. So in Turkey, unfortunately, not the abusers, but those who think and criticize get arrested. That's the case. Thank you. Yes. It's been an hour. Maybe I will ask one final question to Turgut, and then you can also ask your questions through the chat. My question is the following: especially in the most recent period, in terms of the efforts to fight against COVID, we have more surveillance efforts. This makes the regimes more totalitarian, and this creates concerns over fascism rising. And so in this new normal, such exceptions are now becoming the normal. So what kind of rights violations can these create? So you started first, maybe you can start as well, and we can continue.
Well, I do believe that all speakers of this webinar will definitely have very important contributions to make. Professor Fincancı, my dear friend Şebnem, referred to my name while discussing the enforcement law, which enables release on parole. So there are different types of and categories of criminal offenses. And if you allow, I would like to provide you further information. This is like a double-edged sword, so to speak. What I mean is that the individuals who are incarcerated, they have certain rights, and their rights should be protected. As my friends already mentioned, there are also civil society organizations monitoring them and making efforts to protect the rights of inmates. And by the way, I have read the law, and I have read the justifications of the law, and then there's article number 48, which defines 3 categories of criminal offenses. So if an individual committed crime, one of those categories, they are eligible. If they are eligible, then they will be allowed to leave prison, and their sentences will be delayed. But I have to say that the spirit and the letter of this law or this arrangement has nothing to do with COVID-19. It was done by another spirit. So it is based upon restructuring of the judicial system. So when you look into the enforcement law, it doesn't really give you any indication of the pandemic. So let me very briefly go through these different categories of criminal offenses. Intentional homicide. So the Turkish Penal Code 81, 82, 83. And then a serious or a severe injury with consequences. The people convicted of torture. And of course, these are public employees, public sector employees, I have to say. those who are convicted because of persecution for sex offenders, sexual offenders. Another category is those who has been in intercourse with juveniles. 5, crimes against bodily integrity or sexual integrity, but this is only limited with children. So articles 102, 103, and 105, but only in relation to children. Crimes against the right to privacy. So it corresponds to the article 132 of the Turkish Penal Code. Children who are convicted of possessing or selling drugs, again, not adults are not included. And the last category is the crimes against the state, in other words, espionage. So if any of the individuals or individuals are convicted under these 8 categories, then they are allowed to be released on parole, on bail. And of course, there are certain ratios, the way governments apply release on bail or parole. For instance, in Belgium, it is 50-50. In Turkey, there is another ratio. But let us now get back to the issue of fighting against torture. This is something Professor Fincancı already mentioned, and during the introduction, as I was introduced, you referred to the Princeton University study I did, and this commits any sexual offense, this person can benefit from release on bail or parole. Then we need to remember the sexual violence against babies, children, women. This has been an issue for Turkey for many years. We're discussing that. And this has nothing to do with the pandemic. If there are certain individuals who were convicted of these charges, of these crimes, and now if they're allowed to be released on bail, then we need to question where is the public benefit. And I would personally expect the Minister of Justice himself to give me the response. And I cannot really find any reasoning behind this decision to include these certain criminal categories under the enforcement law. I mean, this is a decision, a regulation that comes without a reasoning, without a justification. There is no reason why certain criminal offenders or certain criminal categories are allowed or are eligible to be released and others not. And this enforcement law came out during the pandemic. And during these times, international human rights organizations, local human rights organizations, they made quite important statements and they shared principles about the importance of the release of certain prisoners. United Nations agencies, including the working groups working on different UN conventions, working to monitor different UN conventions, including International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, Economic Rights, CEDAW, Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Migrants and Refugees. So they have these 9 different subcommittees of the United Nations system. They came up with a joint declaration on March 1st. And here is what they said. in terms of health, you need to provide targeted support at UN agencies. And protecting women should only remain in the house. Protecting women is also very important in public spheres, because women are, due to the sectors they're working, are more vulnerable towards contracting COVID-19. Third, they said there should be no scapegoats, there should be no prejudices. Fifth, racism, xenophobia, unbridled nationalism. Unbridled nationalism should be prevented, should be avoided during pandemic. And another principle is state of emergencies that are being declared by governments should always comply with international standards. And again, during the pandemic, dissidents, opposition, should be free from encroachment. They use the term encroach or the term crush. I'm just now quoting unquote from the UN agencies, subcommittees wording from those declaration, encroach and crush. So there should be no human rights limitations inflicted on dissidents and opposition parties to the extent that would amount to encroachment or crushing. Another declaration came from UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes. So these are the criminal offense categories where there are no statute of limitations. And I want you to think these special rapporteurs demand in tandem with what the UN subcommittees already declared. So those parties who committed war crimes or crimes against humanity, they are not exempted. But this special rapporteur makes reference of grave human rights violations, flagrant human rights violations. If there are there are individuals who committed the criminal offense of flagrant human rights violations, then they cannot be released. So that's why it is important for us to understand the statistics about the number of convicts who are being released, along with their category of criminal offense, because this is a public matter and this is very important for public conscience. If you release a public official who committed sexual offense through exerting his or her power using his public office, then this will have certain implications on the public conscience, but we also need to understand how it will benefit to the public, what kind of public good we can expect. And we have to question this. Opposition parties should be questioning this, and civil society organizations should be questioning this as well. So we have been discussing about the tools, instruments, civil society organizations have been using, or different policies CSOs are adopting. Unfortunately, CSOs are faced with an extra burden nowadays, because we do not really have a sufficient level of opposition coming from the opposition parties. That's why CSOs are now shouldering over this duty from the opposition parties. I'm not saying that all CSOs are working now with this mission and working as if they're opposition parties, but what I'm trying to say is that they are heavily burdened now. Let me stop right here. I don't want to monopolize this discussion. Perhaps other friends can answer other questions. Yes, then let us continue with Professor Fincancı. Shall I repeat my question? Or you want to take from where Professor Tarhanlı left? We don't really need to, by the way, stick to the questions. You can contribute on any matter. Well, of course, we also need to think of the future. What kind of mechanism will be in place in the future? What are the prospects? Because the pandemic has clearly showed us that we are wasting the resources of the earth. And because we are misusing and ill-treating the earth and its resources, we may be faced with new pandemics. So I believe that the entire world needs to just sit and come up with something new. In many countries around the world, there have been some meetings, some brainstorming meetings and sessions about where the world heads into and what needs to be done. You can hear me well, right? Because nowadays, also partly because of the pandemic, now we know that there are many limitations, and again, this exacts a heavy toll mostly on people who are not being equally treated anyway. So they are in a way not able to access services. Their access to service is further limited, and this is also the collapse of the neoliberal world as we have seen it. This is something I always say. I think early 2000 marks a new era for the world. It's a new turning point, especially after 9/11. The world evolved into a new era, which is focused on the security, the perception of security. So the resources which certainly need to be allocated, distributed in a free and fair manner has not been the case. Those people who are poor got more impoverished. There is no universal health care coverage in the world. And by the way, there is one thing we need to really praise. In many countries around the world, their public healthcare system collapsed or disbanded. The United States is the biggest example. Their healthcare mechanism was disbanded. However, in Turkey, thanks to the great efforts and struggle of Turkish physicians and members of Turkish physician associations, a public healthcare system in Turkey remained. In other countries, we see that there are elderly people, senior citizens who are left to their own fate, who are left to death in nursing homes. So the reason why Turkey is having an effective or a more effective fight against COVID-19 is because we have a public healthcare system thanks to the efforts of Turkish physicians. So we have a definition of the state, a Leviathan definition of states and Hobbes, but instead of this definition of Leviathan definition of state, we should have a rights-based state, a state that really protects human rights. For instance, in one province, it is not anymore possible to make public statement or press announcement with the pretext of COVID-19 because now there is pandemic. And there was a march of bar association members, lawyers. They wanted to enter or march to the parliament, but they were not allowed in the parliament due to the pandemic. So it is being used as a pretext, and we need to raise our voice against this all together. For instance, we wanted to spread our leaflets on the day against torture in Istiklal Street in Istanbul, but we were not allowed because we also need to carry out our work by staging protests or making our advocacy on the streets. Of course, this is something that all human rights organizations need to do. But now with the pandemic, we also see these problems. And here, let me just once again offer my kudos to physicians and to lawyers for being there, for being independent, for having their independent struggle and calling us into the struggle. And thank you very much.
Before I turn the floor to Zafar, just a reminder for you, we have a small assessment questionnaire on the chat box. We would really appreciate if you could just fill in the questionnaire. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them. I already received a couple of questions. Maybe after Zafar's contribution, I will just ask the questions and wrap up. I guess you have merged some of the questions, right? Yes, it's like that. We have now asked you a couple of questions all at the same time. Okay. So I also would like to send my best regards to the bar associations and to the lawyers. They're doing a wonderful job. And young people also did something wonderful, right? For Recep Tayyip Erdogan. They did something, right? There was an earthquake within the party. So the protest of the young people is as important as the protest of the bar associations. It really gave me hope in a way. But in order to be able to talk about the situation, let's talk about the following. Professor Turgut emphasized the fact that torture is a human rights crime. That's without doubt. But in 2016, we were talking about these things, and by the way, Turkey has ratified certain conventions, and we know that there is no lapse of time for torture, no pardon for it. I attended in 2016 a meeting in Geneva because I was able to travel together with the Turkish Human Rights Association. And in 2017, like I had a strike of lightning, something hit me in the head. I don't know how you would call it, but something really hit me in the head, and you would be surprised when I tell you what it is. And because it's also a story of how today's world is shaped. In 2017, in Eskişehir, during an association that I worked hard for, it's the Youth and Children's Association, we invited the child ombudsman to Eskişehir to talk about these things. And we had also organized a panel session. And one of the speakers during the panel said something. He said it out very loud, by the way. Forget all the conventions that you know. And he repeated it. He said, forget all the human rights convention that you know. He said, we're going to write new ones. And he said that this new convention will be based on the Medina convention of Prophet Muhammad. We were shocked. We were so surprised. I couldn't stop myself. I stood up. I said, you can't say something like this. For everyone who worked in the field of human rights throughout the history of human rights, everyone who made an effort is now subject to disrespect because of you. I asked him how dare he could say those things, and I asked him if that was a state policy. I said, if you are not able to answer these questions, I will leave the meeting room, I said. I worked hard for this meeting. I am also asking the organizers of the meeting to wait for the response. And I asked him to also repeat who he was again, because I knew who he was. Everybody else knew who he was. But do you know who that person was? Ömür Yıldırım. I think I can give his name, because he is still member of the Human Rights Board of Turkey. Can you believe? I mean, when it comes to preventing torture and ill treatment, he is going to play an important role in that institution. So he's member of an institution who is supposed to prevent torture and ill treatment, and a person from that institution says, you should forget about all the conventions against torture or all the human rights conventions because we are rewriting them. We're going to write new ones, he said. Let's forget about what happened back then, but just 2 days ago, Numan Kurtulmuş talked about the Istanbul Convention. These people, they have a problem with the conventions. He said something very concerning. I wrote it, so I will quote. He said there is an expectation in the society, so we have to do something. For a long time, they have been using this. When it comes to removing a right, they say, as if there is an expectation in the society, as if the society wants it, and as the elected party in power, they have to do what the people demand. That's what they claim, that's what they say. So I do believe that, unfortunately, in the coming period, the Istanbul Convention will be a subject of huge debate, because Mr. Numan, he talked about withdrawing from the convention. By the way, I can end my remarks by saying a few things, because let's have time for questions too. I'll say two things. One is this law on the neighborhood guards. We discussed this. We didn't discuss it enough. I mean, it was just on the agenda, and then it became a part of our lives, and it's really, really worrying me. I mean, I'm sure that I will create some problems when the neighborhood keeper or guard asks me my ID. It's not still a law that is passed by the parliament, but we're talking about neighborhood guards that are trained only for 3 days in terms of human rights. Can you believe they will only undergo a human rights training of 3 days, and they will not ill-treat us on the street, right? Can you believe that is possible? No. And the last thing I want to say is that the enforcement officers, meaning the guardians, prison guards. By the way, I know many of them because of our previous projects. They have 2 associations. I follow up on the activities of the associations. I try to make contribution. Very interestingly, most recently, they came up with this study. And do you know what their top 3 demands are? The prison guards are asking for weapons. That's the #1 demand. Can you believe we have 800 babies, infants in prisons? They don't care. They ask for weapons. we have 4 casualties every week in prisons. Sick inmates are dying. Can you believe? But this is not a problem for the prison guards. Their number 1 issue is to have a weapon. What about number 2 problem? Money. They are asking for a raise. They want more money. Of course, in terms of their personnel rights, there should be some improvements. They can ask for these things, but this is something else. They want more money, very clearly. They want more money. And number 3 is status. They want to have the status of a security guard, a law enforcement officer. They are asking for a certain rank to be given to them. With your permission, I'll stop here. Maybe that was a dark way of concluding, but we need to look at the negative things to work harder, because that's what happened during the COVID period. I worked harder, I worked more. Many colleagues working for human rights associations worked more and harder, so we have to work harder. We need to be more vigilant, and we have the young people now who are just criticizing the president, the single man, who are disliking him. So we have so many reasons to be optimistic, I think, seeing those young people. Thank you. Can I also add something very briefly? Yes, of course. Of course, at the international platform, together with this pandemic, a concern was raised, both for Turkey and outside Turkey. People who were contaminated with the disease or their relatives, after a while, there can be a stigmatization of people who had COVID-19. That can be an issue of discrimination, because after the Chernobyl incident in Ukraine, people who were affected by radiation were considered as radio-ethnic people. So these people were stigmatized, and those who survived, of course, had to live with that. I don't know how it will happen for COVID-19, but there is such a risk. We run such a risk both in Turkey and in the world. And even the survivors of the disease, their medical scans are being published now, and maybe that will lead to a stigmatization. We need to pay attention to that. Another topic that I would like to draw your attention to is the following. And we can link it to the most recent judicial developments. The United Nations has a regime, and we are, since 2003, a part of this regime of this international covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. The committee, relevant committee of the UN, came up with the general opinion, the recommendations about the right of health, right to health, and pandemic situations. And in that document, they talk about national health strategies and action plans. This wasn't for the periods of pandemic, but it covers such periods as well. They said you need to have 3 main parameters. 1, respect to respect human rights. 1, accountability, they say. Number 1, accountability. Number 2, transparency. And do you know what number 3 is? Independence of the judiciary. Independence of judiciary. Even the World Health Organization is including this among the international health regulations. So UN human rights agencies are also improving themselves, developing themselves. In 2008, for instance, the High Commissioner for Human Rights said that for the protection of international human rights during that 2008 financial crisis, for those people affected by the crisis, they said only state actors should be included in the protection regime against the crisis. That's what they were saying back in 2008. And now, when we have COVID-19, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights is saying that this is not only or anymore the duty of the states anymore. The civil society, non-state actors, and other state agencies and institutions need to contribute to the actions during the pandemic. That's what they say. And it includes, as a fundamental parameter, the independence of the judiciary. It's very ironic, but this is number 3 after transparency and accountability. So the states will also win as a result of this. As dear Şebnem said in the introduction, we have the story of the foundation of the Turkish Human Rights Foundation, right? And for the Adana branch, back in the 1990s, I guess, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs applied to the Ministry of Interior for the closure of the branch on the following basis. They were coming up with certain reporting activities on torture, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that Turkey is being put in a difficult position in international platforms such as the United Nations because of such reports, because of the reports that the branch was generating. And then the Istanbul Protocol, as Şebnem mentioned, the protocol on the diagnosis of torture, they prepared this report, and Physicians for Human Rights also supported, but the Turkish Human Rights Foundation was the leading agency in that initiative. It was turned into a UN document. So I remember clearly, it was, I think, the mid-90s. From the Human Rights Foundation, we had Önder, and then the head of the permanent representation delegation to UN, and then Mary Robinson from UN. These 3 people had the Istanbul Protocol in their hands, and they had a picture taken all together, saying that this is a UN document now. All these 3 people had a picture taken. So just a few years before that, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was asking for the foundation to be closed down, and the document prepared by that very foundation was actually in the hands of the representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a picture where they posed together with the UN representatives. So it's not only upon the state, but non-state actors to play an important role. The business world, they have to play an important role and support this. Of course, it's not only restricted to the right to health, but for all human rights. That's an important principle that needs to be considered. But the National Health Strategy and Action Plan has to have transparency, accountability, and independence of the judiciary. And we need to emphasize the independence of judiciary. But for the other two parameters, I'm just wondering, for instance, we have the scientific committee established by the Ministry of Health with physicians as members of the scientific committee. The statements of the scientific committee can be seen in the press, in the media on an individual basis. But what about the minutes of the meetings of the committee? We don't know, we don't have access, but it should be made possible that we have access to the minutes of their meetings. I don't even know if the minutes are being taken. We need to know these things because it's necessary for transparency, especially for a health strategy. We don't, for instance, how does it work in Germany? The director of Robert Koch Institute that found the vaccination for TB, for instance, it's an institute for sciences. It's not a political institution, it's a scientific institute. The president makes some announcements. And Merkel just made a statement, most recently, the chancellor. She said, the statements of Robert Koch Institute will be converted into public health policies. So there is this political curtain drawn between science and the society. So the UN International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights and the standards of WHO and those parameters of transparency, accountability need to be taken into consideration when assessing these things. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question that we receive something that is high on the agenda, the case of the bar associations, the plans to crack down on civil society or shut down organizations, and this being the civic space in Turkey at the moment. How do you see the prospects? This is one of the questions we received from our participant. Another participant asks the following question: what will be the new practices and new tools of civil society in the new normal as you struggle for human rights? Well, thank you very much. In fact, we have already covered all these questions, and we have in fact responded to a large extent. Yes, all organizations, including public sector trade unions to other trade unions, independent trade unions, they need to really seriously work on new models to prevent and eliminate discrimination. And other organizations should be working in their own spheres, because during the pandemic, scientific works, scientific papers are nowadays only being able to be published with the approval of the Ministry of Health, ministries. So we need to rethink this. We should not give up on our rights while struggling for rights. So we should make this struggle visible. We should make human rights violations and human and rights limitations and restrictions visible, that we see those restrictions and limitations and we do object to them. If we have some time, I would like to have some additional remarks. Yes, we will be wrapping up, but we will appreciate your brief input. I was expecting Professor Fincancı to raise two issues which I believe very important. Maybe she forgot, maybe she skipped intentionally, but I would like to share them because I believe they're really important. Last week we held a meeting at Boğaziçi University and held a meeting with Boğaziçi University, and one of the questions we received was about the previous practices. In the past, human rights violations would take place after a certain period of time, after a certain time limit. But now rights violations happen immediately, just in a day, in a week, in a month. So I think it's quite important for everyone joining this webinar to know this, everything. The rights violations are taking place immediately. And we also observe an increase in complaints about women, in complaints by women. And this is very important information for me that I would like to share with you. Yes, we have also seen what happened all around the world. In the US, what happened? There were mass protests and demonstrations, and I'm a big fan of John Berger, and Berger says that one needs to protest if there is something to protest, and I think this is something really valuable. How are we going to live otherwise? And I really like this, you know, how are you going to live without a cause to protest against? How are you going to live without this calling? And people went out to the streets, they staged mass protests while keeping their social distance. And I can see that in Izmir, we have a solidarity group with women, and they're doing incredible job every 2 weeks. There are women protesting for their mothers who are in prison, who are jailed. And it's so amazing, the street protests that they are organizing. And they're doing so by complying with all COVID-19 measures and precautions. Then there is another organization, Türkiye Çocuklara Yeniden Özgürlük Vakfı, a foundation for granting freedom again to children of Turkey. And there are valuable CSO workers. I don't want to forget their names, and we should not really forget also the efforts of Turkish Physicians Association. And we are in a position to see the problems in front of us, ahead of us. We can easily foresee what to expect. Because the government gives us the clues, gives us the hints of what to expect. Osman Kavala, a dear friend of Hrant Dink, despite all his good deeds he did for this country, he is jailed, he is in prison for the last 3 years without tangible evidence. Without any justice. And this being the case, we should not really hesitate. We should continue raising our voice. We should continue complaining. We should continue protest. I mean, we were doing this also, you know, before the pandemic. But when are we now more tired? Are we feeling more tired now to go out to the street? Are we living in a country that is more democratic? No, this is not the case. So we should continue our efforts as global citizens. We should always stand against torture and ill treatment, and we will continue our efforts to that end. Let this be my input. Thank you very much. Our time is up for this webinar. It has been really a very good one. We still have quite some questions, but maybe we will do another webinar if we ever come together again. We can do it again. By the way, Merve, I recommend holding this at the foundation physical office premises. I was there when we did this same panel 4 years ago. Yes, I was there. And I don't know when we will be able to come together physically, but I do hope that there will be another occasion that we will gather this panel and continue our conversation. It has been an extremely fruitful discussion for me, and I believe this is also the case for our participants. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much for being out there. It turned out to be quite a long session, but thank you very much for your patience. And I would like to also thank our interpreters. Let us give them an applause. Yes, we will meet each other again. We will meet in good days and healthy days.